All right, everyone. Well, it is almost 1:05 at East Coast time. I want to be respectful not only of your time, but of our panelists and the good conversation that we have forthcoming. My name is Katie Vlietstra-Wannenberg. I'm a co-founder, principal at Public-Private Strategies, who is co-hosting this 4-part series with our friends at Niskanen. And I know Sam we'll be able to close out and provide some closing remarks, Sam Hammond, after we conclude today's program. But I did want to just at the top do some light housekeeping. We are recording this panel discussion so that we can share out with some folks who weren't able to join us. But also as we work our way through this 4-part webinar series, we have a historical record of the conversation, especially since we are hoping with today's conversation and the subsequent ones to really, I think, have an open, honest dialogue about how the midterm elections are going to impact how philanthropy, advocates, the general ecosystem of players will have on crucial aspects of our tax policy. And today we'll be talking about the family tax policy implications. With that, I do want to turn it over to Danielle Goonan, who is with the Rockefeller Foundation and has been supportive of this work, both from PPS and Niskanen. Danielle is the managing director of the U.S. Equity and Economic Opportunity Initiative at the Rockefeller Foundation. And I welcome her to give us, I think, some top lines of why she was interested in funding this work and the importance that it will have. So Danielle, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Katie, to your team, to all of Public-Private Strategies, and to Niskanen Center for all of the work that went into the series. Rockefeller, in particular, was interested in sponsoring these events because the reality is that the midterm elections this fall will probably leave us with a divided government, right? So while there's a diversity of opinions on how we achieve our agenda, I really truly believe that when it comes to economic security and justice, we are overwhelmingly aligned with our goal that America must be structured in such a way that it works for all Americans. So moving forward with pro-worker policies is our shared vision. And I know the shared vision of many of you who are on the call today. And as we prepare for divided government, we need to be considering new strategies. We need to be creating new frameworks. We need to be carving out new pathways with unlikely bedfellows in order to implement permanent solutions to our present economic crisis. So if philanthropy and nonprofits together can't do this, I don't know who can. So I really, truly believe that we have an opportunity vis-a-vis these conversations to begin to design and implement new strategies now that don't just make us relevant, but more importantly, make us effective, particularly after the elections. So thank you all, to the speakers, to the moderators over these 4 events for your time and contribution, and to everyone who's attending. I'm really looking forward to them.
Thank you, Danielle, and the team that she leads at Rockefeller, I think, for pushing for these important conversations. And, not to completely reiterate what Danielle said, but I think to emphasize what she said is the importance that I think is these conversations. And, I think in a lot of the work that we all collectively do, if it's, tax foundationally or policy, they intersect. And I do firmly believe that there is a lot more commonality that than would lend itself to believe if you're looking at news reports or other things. And so I think it's really important today that we are bringing such a diverse group of speakers together. I think participants who are joining us today is cross-sector, from nonprofit voices to advocates to business, and really talking about how we can find commonality on these issues. And today's conversation will be really important. I think that also the conversation is, we have been operating in a political world that has, been one party. And how can we build capacity knowing that that's going to change most likely come November? And how can we continue to meet the needs of the American people, which I think, I don't speak for our moderator and our panelists today, but I think at the root of what we all do is that we want to make this world better for the people that inhabit it, for successive generations, and that we want to ensure that economic policy is serving the greatest number of people possible. And I think, this is really important as philanthropy is thinking about its the back half of 2022 and how it's putting together plans in place for 2023. I am just really excited that we are also coming at this from a bipartisan perspective of understanding that it's going to take us all working together. We're going to have disagreements. There are some things that, potentially are non-starters, non-negotiable, but I do think that during these conversations, it is going to become more evident that there's a lot more that is actually on the table and is in agreement and we can work towards. So with that, I don't want to delay in introducing our panel. And first, we are having a fantastic moderator, Greg Nassif, Director of Public Affairs at Humanity Forward. Humanity Forward, if you don't know, is a nonprofit advocating at the federal level to strengthen families, decentralize economic opportunity, and end poverty in America. Their work on the child tax credit has been a critical part of the collective work in a pursuit of a fully refundable, expandable child tax credit. So with that, Greg, I'm going to turn it over to you and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Katie. It's my pleasure to be here. It's an honor. And thank you and welcome to our panel and to our many folks watching at home. Just to add a little bit about Humanity Forward and what we've been doing, we've been part of this broad advocacy push for the child tax credit to be expanded, made fully refundable, distributed on a monthly basis. We were aware from the very beginning, however, that poverty reduction alone would be an insufficient argument alone to achieve a bipartisan majority or a majority period to pass Congress and to keep this program alive. So we've been targeting lawmakers in the political center of both parties to advocate on this issue, making the case that an expanded CTC could better support working class families while reducing bureaucracy. We supported several comprehensive studies to show the expected and unexpected benefits of the program. And we've organized advocates and experts in key districts and states. And my boss will be angry at me for saying it, but we were recognized for our growth and our influence when he was named as one of the Hill's top 100 lobbyists in 2021, our head of government and policy, Paolo Mastrangelo. On this, I can say we've made some progress. We've whittled down opposition. We've maintained a seat at the table with both parties. And we've been able to keep a roadmap in place to a CTC in the next Congress. We're hoping to roll out a CTC victory and a step towards a bipartisan pathway, perhaps through tax extenders. So we'll keep our fingers crossed on that. I want to welcome our panel here. I'll introduce folks one at a time here. So starting with Mr. Wells King, the research director at American Compass. Wells, their mission is to restore an economic consensus that emphasizes the importance of family, community, and industry to the nation's liberty and prosperity. Wells's writing has appeared in National Review, First Things, and the American Conservative, among other publications. His research for American Compass has been featured in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Bloomberg, among others. And he previously worked as a policy advisor to Senator Mike Lee, serving on the Joint Economic Committee and the Social Capital Project. He's also served as a management consultant at McKinsey & Company. He is a Publius Fellow at the Claremont Institute and a James Madison Fellow at Hillsdale College's Van Andel Graduate School of Statesmanship. He's a native North Carolinian and a graduate of Davidson College. He lives here in Washington, D.C. Also, Adrienne Schweer, a fellow and she is a BPC Fellow, Bipartisan Policy Center, and leads its paid family leave task force. She's a Nebraska native. She worked for years in campaigns there and came to Washington, D.C. to work for then Senator Chuck Hagel. After her years of service on Capitol Hill, she joined the Rockstar Bono's nonprofit association, the One Campaign, where she led partnership strategy and advocacy in support of African development, including maternal and child health. She also served as chief protocol to 3 defense secretaries, Chuck Hagel, Ashton Carter, and Jim Mattis at the Pentagon. In 2015, she started a nonprofit association, Family Leave Works, to find bipartisan solutions to paid family leave. And in 2018, she helped Bipartisan Policy Center stand up the first bipartisan paid family leave task force. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in History and Communications from the University of Nebraska and is a recipient of multiple awards, including the Secretary of Defense Medal for Outstanding Public Service. She and her husband have 3 young daughters and a son. And finally, we have Patrick Brown. He is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, where his work focuses on developing a robust pro-family economic agenda and supporting families as the, I'm quoting here, cornerstone of a healthy and flourishing society. Prior to joining EPPC, Brown served as a senior policy advisor to Congress's Joint Economic Committee. He has written and spoken on pro-family tax policy, child care and education policy, welfare reform, pro-life advocacy efforts, and other topics. He's also a contributing editor to American Compass, where he inaugurated the Edgerton Essay series, featuring first-person essays from working-class Americans. He also serves on Humanity Forward's advisory board. In addition to his experience on Capitol Hill, he has worked in a diocesan communications office and as a government relations staffer for Catholic Charities USA. He's also a book reviewer for the Catholic News Service. He graduated from the University of Notre Dame with a degree in political science and economics. He holds a master's in public affairs from Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. He and his wife Jessica have 3 young children and live in Columbia, South Carolina. I'm going to start with you, Patrick, with our first question. As we talked about the child tax credit, it's now been 5 months since the monthly payments program has stopped. And we are potentially on the verge of Roe versus Wade being overturned. We're entering potentially a post-Roe reality. You wrote a piece in the New York Times about this. So I'm going to ask you, what strategies do we in the advocacy community need to begin to develop and implement for the seismic political shift that's coming for us?
Well, Greg, first of all, thanks for inviting me to be on here and the very generous introduction. I do think that the politics around support for families is going to shift in the wake of the Roe, the Dobbs decision. And I think we're already starting to see some of those tectonic plates begin to move on the right. I mean, everyone on this call knows about the bill that Senator Romney introduced last February. I think that really got the ball rolling on a lot of conversations on the right of center, recognizing that for a lot of people who have been involved in this sort of pro-life space over the last 5 decades, now they're a world in which states now have more ability to regulate access to abortion is one in which they're going to have to put their money where their mouth is when it comes to being truly pro-life and pro-family. And so what I've been working on and arguing for over the last couple months here is taking family policy seriously as a way to put that into practice. And this is something that the sort of pro-life, pro-family, social conservative wing of the party has taken up the child tax credit as a sort of cause celeb in the past. This is how we got the original child tax credit passed in the mid-90s when sort of religious conservatives, Ralph Reed and the Christian Coalition joined forces with some of the more progressive anti-poverty groups to institute the first child tax credit in the 97 budget, and it's grown over time. So I think the onus is on social conservatives to really take that seriously, and I think we are seeing movement in that direction. Yesterday, the Republican Study Committee, which is one of the more hardline conservative groups in the House, released a statement of principles that talked about supporting families and recognizing that parents who want to have a parent, usually a mom, stay home are going to face an economic disadvantage because they don't have 2 workers in the workforce. And what better way to support them than by some sort of child allowance that's tied to having a parent in the workforce. And so I think we're going to be seeing that conversation continue to play out in the weeks and months ahead. And for the sort of philanthropy community, I think as I say, the onus is on conservatives to figure out ways that policy can support families in practice as well as in lip service. But I think for some of the folks on maybe in the center or the center left, that means being willing to make strange bedfellows coalitions with groups that maybe they haven't worked with previously or might disagree with on certain matters, but realize that there is a genuine desire to want to support families, and that if it happens to come through because of this court decision and the shifting legal landscape, I think there's a real opportunity there, and I hope that people take it up.
Mm-hmm. Definitely take to take to heart the concept of strange bedfellows. I think we've been working on that for a long time to try to put some folks together. And I want to follow up about the concept of the realignment on the right. I'm going to take it over to Wells. Wells, you've written about this as well. Can you discuss the realignment that's going on the right in conservative circles? And can you share about what you've been observing there, and how can funders, philanthropies, how can they incorporate that shift into their strategy?
Sure. So, well, first, it's great to be here and participate in a really important discussion. Family policy is one of sort of, I think, the prime issues for a realigned Republican Party to lead. And I think many Republican lawmakers, Senator Romney included, but many others, are wanting to take advantage of the opportunity. And I think the opportunity they see, as you mentioned, is an ongoing ideological and coalitional realignment. I think there's two really salient points to be made here. First is a coalitional one. I think many elected Republicans are looking at the last two election cycles, and they're seeing a shift in who their core base is. It's increasingly a party of parents, and it's increasingly a party of people without college degrees. That is, people that tend to be in the working and middle class. And they're wanting to distance themselves from the image of the party of big business and of the country club, and wanting to find ways, at the very least rhetorically, to message to that base. But the other shift is an ideological one. The sort of free market and fiscally austere wing of the party is losing its grip on its center. I think you saw this immediately with President Trump, or then candidate Trump, in the 2016 primaries, when he didn't push for entitlement reform. And even when he governed, was racking up tremendous fiscal deficits despite running as a conservative. And so increasingly, there is an appetite for creative policymaking, including in the tax and fiscal policy space, beyond mere tax cuts. And so I think an expanded CTC fits in perfectly here. It is immediate economic relief directly to working and middle class families. And an expanded CTC would go beyond merely a tax cut. It really would go beyond tax liability and would increase the incomes of working and middle class families. I think the advantage, though, and I think this is where advocates and philanthropy have a role to play, is I think in terms of crafting the messaging and the advocacy around this policy. I think that the Biden expansion, and I think the reason why it sort of failed to resonate with sort of a realigned right, is that it was framed around child poverty reduction. What's really going to motivate, I think, Republican lawmakers that are wanting to seize the opportunity they see with their shifting coalition and ideological center is one that's framed around economic relief and support for working parents. It's not a benefit for the child, it's the benefit for the parents. It's about supporting them economically and reinforcing the sort of core values they understand to be work and marriage. And so trying to shift the message somewhat from being one merely of child poverty reduction towards supporting working parents. I think this is the key. And I think that this is the message that we'll begin to see emerge, particularly next Congress, should Republicans take power in Congress.
Thank you, Wells, and understanding that point about working parents and shifting resources toward them. Sometimes when it seems like when the budget negotiations were unfolding, as the pot of money kind of shrunk, we heard more discussions about how we can prioritize parents, where that money can go. So I'm going to take the next question over to Adrian. As we talk about helping parents more often the conversation has revolved around the CTC, but philanthropy has invested significantly in a broad array of pro-family tax policies. So how can folks ensure that other critical policies like, say, paid family leave or affordable childcare, how can we ensure that these other policies get equal attention, that they can get across the legislative finish line? And where do you think those policies can be targeted?
I want to respond to a couple of things Wells said first, and then I'd love to get that one because Paley is my favorite conversation. But I think what Wells just said is the most pointed and awful part of the ecosystem that we're in. It is not specific to Republicans. It is a national conversation, but our country has totally devalued children and babies, and we just don't care anymore. And that is proven with the narrative around infant formula. It is all about parents hunting at grocery stores, not about children at NICUs who can't find formula. And like the narrative discussion on all things kids, what happened in Texas, has been almost entirely about adults who made bad, selfish decisions about adult well-being, not child well-being. And it stems much from pandemic policy and caring for, teachers and adults, and no conversation about the well-being of children. And I know that hits like tons of trigger points for everybody on this call, but I think what Wells said is incredibly important. The next 2 years will be a refocus on, hopefully, towards children, and we have a responsibility to drive that conversation and to help people see that benefit. But in reality, it is going to be the worker themselves and the voter and the adult in that equation. And we have to stop sometimes playing. It's almost like the African development work I did in my old life, when we led with, children with flies in their eyes and transitioned to a totally different visual and narrative on how to address these problems. That's exactly what we all need to focus on and change. And I know that doesn't sound great, but Wells, I thought that was a really good point. I just wanted to double down on that. I also think on CTC, because that is the center of the conversation, I don't want everyone here to forget that like a Republican-led government doubled CTC not that long ago. So great things can be done by Republicans. And the Democrats that we're going to see be reelected in the next year or elected are going to be moving to the center, including the president, who's no longer going to need to run to a progressive left, but will be running to a center to win Hispanics and independents back from these last few years. So we are naive if we think that any, 2-4 years from now, Democratic-led government is going to be as left-leaning as it was over the last 2 years, and realigning our investments and our focus to what can be done by this like beautiful new thing that's happening with these gangs in the Senate, moving meaningful bipartisan policy that include all kinds of non-traditional pay-fors and hangers on, but like no one knows about those things. Nobody's getting celebrated for those things. Those gangs could die this year if we don't respond to them. And if we are lucky enough to see some version of CTC come together in a tax extenders, it will be in a gang. And we should all be thinking about what we can do to celebrate the heck out of that, to try and reinvigorate it so we don't have a lapse like we just did with CTC. Sorry, I know that was like not at all what you asked, Greg, but I also think that Republicans in particular are really focused on working parents and placating this new electorate that is going to bring them to office. And you're going to see Republicans that look Trumpian on top line message and campaign, and that's what they're being told in the news, like JD Vance, that actually have a working family, working class agenda underneath them. And very early on, this community and all kind of C3, C4 investments need to be educating those members and those staff to have non-traditional views on a lot of the working family policies that we are trying to advance that don't take us back to a 1970s, 1980s conversation, because much of well, there will be turnover and some new voices at the top level. A lot of the staff will be the same. And we've got to break through some of that and have creative content come November, December, January, that's educating a new Congress, regardless of its makeup, to be prepared to take some bold steps on a working family agenda. And you brought up my favorite subject of paid family leave. I think it is like the most loved and opportune policy in our country for bipartisanship. It was then candidate Trump's only policy agenda in his entire presidential campaign. It failed ethically in a Dem-only reconciliation strategy. And we have to like really learn why it didn't even work for moderate Democrats and realign what good paid leave policy could look like under a divided government, and try and move it forward. And unfortunately, a lot of the philanthropic investments over the last 2 years in that space, this pairs very well with CTC, to be honest, have pulled the conversation really far to the left, and they now need to bolster the center. And I just want to say on CTC, you've got Senator Bennett in Colorado up for re-election. He's not a safe seat. Like Cook Report puts him up there. Colorado is a funky place, and he's not a safe seat, and he's going to be running to the center too. And we should all be surrounding him, testing some of these messages, because if he has an opportunity in a lame duck, we need him to really want to take it and negotiate. And if he comes back, we need him to continue to lead. And we have a lot of people like that, Patty Murray, Bennett, like a lot of stalwarts on these issues who are in jeopardy right now on the left even. Sorry, Greg, back to you.
No, I appreciate that that gives me two answers, allows me to go in kind of a snake order here. So really appreciate your details on that and the many options you've laid out for folks here. I want to give you, Wells, a chance to respond, and I want to ask you another question as well here. Adrian talked about the different policies and how we can approach new Republican campaigns, as well as senators who are currently in office on these policies. You wrote a recent piece in the Deseret News, a great publication, about how a monthly benefit for families could replace a myriad of unworkable, confusing programs. And as we think about the children here and these programs that were designed to help them that may not be doing a very good job, can you kind of elaborate on that and explain how simplicity could be a winning message for folks here?
Sure. So as I argued, along with my co-author, Brad Wilcox of UVA and the American Enterprise Institute, what Republicans could push for come next Congress would be a signature expansion and reform of the child tax credit that would collapse some of the existing tax credits. So for instance, the CDCTC, some of the additional payments that are associated with dependents in the EITC, and of course, the current CTC, into a single monthly child tax credit. This is simpler. Obviously, this has some messaging advantages, but I think this key advantages, first of all, is that it's more helpful and useful for parents in terms of not only receipt, it would be on a monthly basis, unlike a lot of these existing tax credits. It would be a singular payment. And so it's easier to factor into their monthly budgets and actually be used for the types of things that they need, be it infant formula or being able to take off a few more hours of work each week to spend with their child for daycare and so on. So the simplicity, I think, helps the recipients. It also, I think, helps for future reforms. I think it lays a straightforward groundwork for playing with one particular benefit that we understand to go directly to parents. We could potentially change the administration of it in terms of trying to move it out of the tax code entirely and into, say, the Social Security Administration to be more of a form of social insurance. It sort of lays the groundwork for all kinds of meaningful reforms that are explicitly pro-family and not wrapped up in other things that these other benefits are trying to do. But on the messaging point, I think the simplicity point is going to be really, really key, particularly for Republicans. Patrick was describing potentially a post-Roe political environment and really the sort of need that I think pro-life Republicans are going to have. Our president is very fond of saying, don't tell me what your values are, show me your budget and I'll tell you what your values are. I think pro-life and pro-family Republicans are going to be in this position. They've been saying for decades on messaging that they're pro-life and pro-family. And this creates a very simple, straightforward opportunity for them to be able to communicate to the American people that here is a fiscal policy and a fiscal commitment to the American family and the American child. And so collapsing these existing tax credits into an expanded child tax credit aimed at children and working families. It's simple, it's straightforward, it's fiscally responsible, but most importantly, allows them to make that simple fiscal commitment point to the American voter.
Thank you, Wells. I'm going to take this back to Patrick. So, Wells, you talked about the political reality we're kind of entering here and the power of a simple credit to run on for Republicans. So, Patrick, I want to ask you kind of about this. I want to ask you to elaborate on this political reality that we're entering in with the current state of family tax policy, especially the child tax credit. And kind of what you think could be a good winning message for Republicans running on family tax policy. Is it at what Wells described here, the working family tax credit? Pardon me, Wells, if I didn't get that exactly right. But I want to hear your thoughts on that as well, Patrick.
Yeah, I basically endorse everything Wells just said. I think it's important to recognize, as we're talking about a shift in power in DC, that the vocabulary that Republicans bring to the table when we're talking about families is different than, as you might expect, is different than the language that progressives tend to use. And I think, especially in the philanthropic and nonprofit space, a lot of times those organizations and those discussions are sort of just imbibe the sort of progressive framework, as we talked about earlier, the sort of framing the child tax credit as an anti-poverty strategy first and foremost. Not that anyone's pro-child poverty, but that just doesn't resonate with Republicans in the same way that talking about supporting families does. And I think, as well as mentioned earlier, the soft support that we saw for the expanded child tax credit under that the Biden administration had, I think was really tied to their misread of the popularity of a universal credit. And the focus groups that we did last summer, as these checks were beginning to roll out, parents who were receiving the CTC still felt like it was unfair in a way, or that for parents who weren't working to be receiving the same benefits that they were. And we can criticize, well, maybe that's not fair or whatever, but as a political matter, benefits that aren't tied to work, that don't have some conditional participation, aren't conditional participation in the workforce, just come across as welfare. And we can, there are people who will fight about that. And certainly in Congress, there are a lot of people who are willing to scrap common ground initiatives to move the ball forward on the sort of principle of the thing. But I think that era, as Adrienne said earlier, is passing, if not has already passed. And so progressives need to recognize that the language is going to be different when Republicans talk about it. But having, if you have a plan like I sort of sketched out in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, where as long as a family meets a very low income threshold, they're eligible for the full credit. I think that is an approach that can get most of the way to a universal child tax credit, and even if it's not the full sweeping vision that some on the left would like. And again, I think on the paid leave question that we brought up earlier, I think part of the reason why paid leave hasn't gotten put on the agenda in a meaningful way is because the leading Democrat proposal for paid leave was so expansive. It covered every sort of condition under the sun, not just parental leave, but sick leave and caring for a family member and all these other things. And I think that's where you start to lose Republican votes who are concerned about the impact that might have on businesses. So I think a much more targeted paid leave program that focused specifically on parental leave would be something that you would see the sort of center right senators of the world taking up and voting on. And I think that would actually have a strong chance of passing in a Republican Congress. So I think, again, it's understanding that there is definitely middle ground solutions that can be advanced. It just might require a shift in approach and in vocabulary.
Can I jump in, Greg, with just a couple of things on what Patrick said? Because I think we're talking about the Supreme Court decision and a couple of things that I just want to flag for this audience. As much as it gets national headlines and is driven and could very well, the dynamic over the next 6 months could change. Right now, voters do not have abortion on their top 10 list of things they care about and are bringing to the election in November. And I think that's really important to note. Also, I forget where I got the statistic. Maybe Melinda Gates wrote it a long time ago, but I remember in my head someone saying that 99 cents of every dollar that goes to like women and child family issues from the philanthropic community is going to reproductive rights campaigns. And like that's part of a problem too, right? Like where all the dollars are going to this conversation around reproductive rights on two ends of the spectrum that hold us hostage on anything else when we really need people investing in non-traditional pathways and stuff that doesn't look cool and like makes a lot of compromise instead of being really great. And maybe it's because I come from the Bipartisan Policy Center. I've been like in the not cool part of the paid leave conversation for the last 4 years, but there's just not a lot of resource in this like space in the middle where things don't look great. They look like squishy and unfortunate, but they make compromises and reach lots of people. And I am really confident that the recent CTC transitioning to monthly benefits and all the things that came with it could never have happened if Republicans hadn't led a doubling of child tax credit in 2017. And we have to allow these baby steps so that we can build upon them in the future when you have a stronger consensus of like-minded elected officials. And if politics tell us anything, we're not headed there anytime soon. The country is filled with people who are really struggling. And I just want to elevate one other thing to when you're thinking about the child poverty argument. We did some research recently that showed that 60% of working moms can't take 4 weeks without pay, and 1/4 couldn't go 1 week without pay. They couldn't afford any of the things in their lives. And that framing is so much more powerful to the country right now, that like working mom framing, than the child poverty framing. And we've got to invest in it and that side of the equation from a polling and narrative perspective. And we've got to like transition some of our education work on the Hill to be really about that like working mom, working parent framework. And I don't think we have enough happening in that, especially in this critical time. But I agree with everything Patrick said too. Like the policies that we want to advance, they're going to look like things that don't look like principled policy to the ecosystems that have been invested in the last couple of years. And we're going to need philanthropy to back some of that up and help celebrate the baby steps so the big steps can happen in the future.
Thank you, Adrian. I want to ask a question to the group here to kind of follow up on some things you've all said. And first, I also want to invite folks who are watching, if you want to submit questions, please do so through the Q&A forum here. This is something that was asked, and I'm going to blend it with a question of mine as well. We talk often about working families. Senator Mitt Romney, his original plan proposed providing a benefit through the Social Security Administration, regardless of income. I also want to read a quote from Galen Carey, the VP of Government Relations at the National Association of Evangelicals. He said, "Work is critically important to human dignity, but having a particular level of earned family income should not be a prerequisite to accessing support for their children." So I'm going to open up this question to the group here about the not only the connection between work and receiving help, but also the connection between income and the level of income and receiving help. How can Republicans message this, and how can and what where should they meet families in both their needs and also the dignity of work itself? So I'll leave that one open. Well,
I'm happy to start. Yeah, so the question of work is, I think, at the end of the day, the really sort of core question when it comes to a bipartisan compromise around the child tax credit. Patrick began his remarks today by noting sort of the conversation that took place on the right of center, that Senator Romney's original proposal for a child tax credit expansion kicked off the Family Security Act. It kicked off a huge debate on the right of center, and a lot of it ultimately landed, at least on the right, with the fact that it was unattached to work. And not only that it was unattached to work, but that one of its pay-fors was ditching TANF and seemed to sort of turn back some of the signature welfare reforms that we saw in the 90s. I don't anticipate that conservatives or Republicans are going to sort of cede this particular point on work. They want to see basic reciprocity there. I think really does come down to sort of how are we going to define work in this case? Do we want it especially technocratic and onerous work requirement, or do we want a basic threshold? And then also just how generous are we going to be? We, at least at American Compass, so Orrin Cass, our executive director, and I have suggested that we have a very simple threshold, and that above that threshold, it should be very low. You should be able to meet it with a part-time job at a minimum wage. You should be able to receive your full, the full amount of the benefit. And before you reach that threshold, you should essentially match your income. So you should see a doubling of your income. It's a generous way of support, but ensures that families that don't have an attachment to the workforce are supported in other ways. So we would preserve TANF and think there are a number of ways to make our welfare system more generous, but also I think treat the unique needs that families without a worker in them deserve. But I think there may also be some room potentially to relax that work requirement, at least in the first 2 years of a child's life. And understanding that parents with young children, especially newborns, have a particular set of demands. It's hard to maintain a job, particularly for single parents in those early years. And so finding some kind of way potentially to compromise, to either relax or even eliminate that work requirement in that first or second year of the child's life, I think could be one meaningful path to bipartisan reform there.
I love that, Wells, and I agree.
Thank you, Wells. And that knocked out kind of my next question. I would invite someone to elaborate on this about how this is a question from the audience that 25% of children in the United States are headed by a single parent, and that particularly their early years, it can be extremely challenging to meet an income threshold and also raise their children. So maybe I can pitch back to Patrick here to talk about the important how philanthropies can approach this. And how they can talk about the supporting family and narrative, and as well as the marriage incentive.
Yeah, no, I basically agree with just a few caveats on what Wells said. I think the technical details of how we approach that sort of extremely low income population, we can sort of haggle that out. But I think as a matter of principle, I think that's the right way to think about it in terms of you supporting people's income up to a threshold and then trying to make that as achievable as possible. I think when we're talking about low income single parents, especially, this is where we have to acknowledge that the child tax credit can't be the only part of a pro-family agenda. And I think that when we talk about, it's easy for us to focus on it as a cornerstone of pro-family politics, because I think it is. But I think especially when we talk about single moms making $10,000 a year or something like that, there are other tools in our toolbox that we need to be thinking about. And so whether again, kind of coming back to where I started, when we talk about expanding Medicaid coverage for a year postpartum, or funding for WIC or stuff like that, those are obviously available to us. And I think again that the political valence of those will be shifting in the next couple of weeks, I think. But also, we haven't really talked about childcare directly on this call, and I think that's also a part of the conversation, especially around this target population. Conservatives, we saw in the debate over Build Back Better, react very negatively to the idea of an individual entitlement to childcare, and I don't think there's going to be any room for that sort of thing on the right in the future, and probably for the right reason, I think. But for low-income women, especially single moms, I think there is a role, especially in the post-welfare reform world, of strategic investment in making the child care market work better. And we have this through the child care block grant program. And so, we saw Senator Burr and Senator Scott of South Carolina introduce a bill a couple of weeks ago now that would sort of reorient the CCBG program around sort of more conservative principles, making sure that religious providers are not just protected but robustly affirmed being part of the CCDBG program, explicitly affirming parental choice and even expanding some subsidies. So I think that kind of approach, recognizing that for some women, the child tax credit is not going to be the only solution, that we need to be making childcare more accessible and more available to them. I think that's completely appropriate for us to be talking about. Now, is that going to be the first thing on our Republican Congress's agenda? Probably not. But I think it's, as we've seen, Richard Burr and Tim Scott are no one's idea of a squishy moderate. These are conservative members on the right who are taking childcare seriously, and we see other senators who've engaged in this topic as well. So I think that's another part of the conversation that needs to be included in a pro-family agenda.
Mm-hmm. Somebody who's worked a lot in these in other policies, of course, is Adrian. So Adrian, any thoughts to that as well on other policies that can help parents?
So I want to go back to having just come from this really robust study of what working moms in particular are facing. I want to highlight some of the things that they said are holding them back, because I feel like we have an opportunity to frame from their perspective and drive change. But their number one was flexibility at work. And every time we survey and try and understand what working parents need, they specifically want their benefits tied to their employer, and they want things like local through their religious institutions, and all that conversation kind of disappeared last year in a lot of our policy negotiation. And we've got it reinvigorated and put it back. But that's really hard when you're trying to design social insurance and government-run policy to allow for that level of individualism. And I think we need to acknowledge that and think about non-traditional ways to bypass that and work around it. Paid leave is a great example where it's hard for a lot of people to say, well, I'm just going to take 12 weeks stat. Some people are going to do it in different ways. Some people are going to do it in shorter waves, and those need to be individual choices, and they need to have a little bit of flexibility in that process. And that hasn't been on the table as much. But I also think I agree with Patrick childcare is the elephant in the room. I would venture to guess a lot of people on this call do a lot of investing in the childcare space. And I don't think we've had any of the right answers in the policy conversations over the last few years. It certainly doesn't feel to working parents that those policy options that are being organized around are really going to be the silver bullet solution, which is a lot of the reason why we haven't had a lot of success and progress. So I would challenge us to think a little bit differently, but I put paid leave, I put direct resources to parents and to workers in this perspective. I think there's an entire caregiving agenda that we've ignored here talking about kids. We have a lot of people that are struggling with elder caregiving of loved ones. A lot of those are working parents themselves, and it's holding them back from achieving their full goals. And I think there's childcare, which is one of the biggest ones, but I feel like there's a lot of opportunity in the next Congress to try and push some of that forward. We just have to look at it with a different lens and take baby bites at the apple. And look for non-traditional kind of partners. We're losing this year with retirements. We're losing a lot of the best players that were most ripe for compromise on these issues. And so we've got to build a larger bench moving in, especially in the Senate.
Thank you, Adrian. And we're just about out of time. So just on the point, I want to invite anyone to follow up on the idea of strategies that donors can implement. If you can throw in something for 30 seconds, welcome to do so. Or not.
Well, give me all the money would be the first thing. But more practically, I think it's really important to have time to have these conversations, ideally in person, but Zoom is also an acceptable substitute at times. I've been part of a couple of these sort of cross-partisan, transpartisan, discussions and finding areas that we can sort of coalesce around some of the, baby steps that we were talking about earlier. So I think those kind of things are going to be even more important in an era of divided government, and especially, depending on how the next 2 years goes, if Republicans take back, the White House in 2024, you could be looking at the rest of the decade, really, where it's going to be really important for philanthropic organizations to have space to just bring sort of common good-minded people in the room and have these open discussions. And I think that can kind of get overlooked in the sort of public game, but I think in DC, especially, having those debates, having those conversations take place is essential.
I would say, Greg, I think we have this basic process where we fund the campaigns to get things done and then fund implementation and technical assistance. And we're missing in their celebration. There should be a whole C3, C4 strategy to celebrate the success and bolster the members that do the hard work and make sure that we hold their feet to fire in future stuff. And I think that also that was a Democratic lesson learned from the rescue plan too, right? CCC is a great example of how we didn't celebrate in the right ways with the right messaging in all the right places to continue on and let things lapse. So I would love to see a stronger equation that's looking at a 3-part strategy that includes a big celebration strategy and an implementation strategy. I think that's one donor area of opportunity. And then I think the other is just there is a dearth of players in the center right now because we've been funding the two ends, and the two ends are holding hostage anything that could get done in the center. And that is going to get even stronger after Dobbs. It's going to get even stronger to the fringe on the right and to the fringe on the left. And if there is not a strategy to really bolster the members that make some hard decisions, because some of these policies are going to be compromising on core principles, then we will have failed in our agenda and our effort. So that would be my suggestion. Over to you, Wells.
Yeah. There, as I believe that Adrian had mentioned earlier, there are, I think, going to be several incoming Republican members that'll be newly elected officials, I think, getting acclimated to Washington and getting acclimated to policymaking itself. They're going to need support, they're going to need ideas, but they also come in with a fresh perspective and are usually have a much greater appetite for doing something meaningful for working families. And I think breaking away from some of the economic consensus that has gripped the right of center and has prevented them from wanting to make sort of meaningful fiscal commitments to the American family. I think identifying who those incoming lawmakers are going to be, and then finding ways to engage in good faith, arming them with the data and the talking points, and then bringing them into these bipartisan circles in a way that still allows them to message as sort of, true conservatives that kind of appeal to their conservative base while still being able to make meaningful bipartisan reform is, I think, going to be the ticket to something next Congress.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody. I want to thank our panelists, Adrian, Patrick, and Wells, for taking the time to be here. I want to thank Public-Private Strategies for putting this on. I want to thank Niskanen and the Rockefeller Foundation for supporting this. Thank you, all of you watching at home, for tuning in and listening to this great discussion. I'm going to turn it over to Sam Hammond. He's the Director of Social Policy at the Niskanen Center. His research focuses on the effectiveness of cash transfers and alleviating poverty, and how free markets can be complemented by robust systems of social insurance. He previously worked as an economist for the Government of Canada, specializing in rural economic development, and he worked as a graduate research fellow for the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you for everyone who tuned in, whether live or on the recording that should be available in the next day or two. So just to close, I'd like to return to a point that Danielle made at the very top of the event, namely that advocacy and philanthropy needs to be forward-looking and open to rethinking their strategies for our likely future of divided government. Partisan polarization is at an all-time high across a variety of measures. The belief of Niskanen and our partners is that the obvious and often heated divides between left and right, Republicans and Democrats, progressives and conservatives, hide deeper areas of potential agreement. As Wells noted when he spoke, the fiscal wing of the Republican Party is, quote, losing its grip on its center, with entitlement reformers giving way to a faction open to proactively supporting workers and families. I think the key word there is faction, because polarization can cause us to see Republicans and Democrats as if they're monoliths, but in truth, they contain multitudes. Whether it's pro-family and pro-business Republicans, they sometimes agree and sometimes they don't. The same is true of progressive and moderate Democrats. So in a world of divided government, advocacy and philanthropy can and should make its greatest impact by understanding the nature, not just of our divided government, but our divided parties. And where left and right factions overlap, obviously agreement won't be easy, but it'll be exponentially easier if we have these kind of cross-ideological dialogues, so we understand where each side is coming from. And if we make the investments to create the safe spaces, as Patrick mentioned, to have discussions that can reach a compromise. So, that includes many of the shared issues we talked about today, from the child tax credit to paid leave. So whether it's embracing new framings or focusing, as Patrick suggested, on the subset of a policy like parental leave, a more targeted approach that exploits the deepest areas of agreement, there's a lot of potential here. Of course, left and right often agree on the benefits of a reform, but too often the debate breaks down when one side demands consensus on the why at the expense of the what. So we need to sort of, looking ahead, flip that order of priority and identify areas of convergence, the what, but allow each side to frame the issue in a way that gives them the freedom to embrace their own why. So to that end, I hope you can join us for our next panel this Monday at noon, June 6th. It's going to, much like this covered family policy, it will cover areas of potential agreement on labor and workers, pro-family, pro-worker and employment tax policy, things like the EITC and unemployment insurance reform, labor law. It will be moderated by Judy Conti, the Director of Government Affairs at NELP, and it will be joined by Jessica Fulton, VP of Policy at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, Matt Darling from Niskanen Center, where he covers employment policy, Andrew Stetner, a Senior Fellow at the Century Foundation, and Chris Griswold, Wells' colleague at American Compass. Thank you.
Thanks all for joining us. And this will end our first webinar, part one of our series. And again, as Sam just said, hope that you will join us on Monday for our second installment. And with that, Greg, Wells, Adrian, Patrick, thank you so much for your time. And I hope everyone has a great weekend. Thanks so much.